Late one night in an apartment in San Francisco, when the digital noise had drained his mind to the point of exhaustion, Elias decided to try something. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to think of nothing at all. There was no encroaching darkness, only a pure expanse of nothingness. The young engineer imagined that void as a silent object floating within his mind. He allowed his consciousness to drift into a simulated universe where all matter had completely decayed. In that place, photons and leptons were spaced too far apart to form any energetic processes, and the temperature of all things had frozen at nearly absolute zero. There was nothing, or more precisely, no observable fragments of matter remained. All the stars had faded, and the gargantuan black holes had now evaporated and vanished forever. There was not even a tiny ripple of change to distinguish one moment from the next. And perhaps, most tragically, there were no longer any conscious beings left to witness this grand nothingness. Then, Elias abruptly opened his eyes. The scenery of reality immediately surged back into his awareness with a contrast so sharp it felt suffocating. Shattering the absolute silence of that secluded void was the labored, rhythmic whirring of his laptop's cooling fan, mingled with the incessant beeps of new notifications from his phone, which blinked without ceasing. Between the vast, silent space he had just entered and the ear-piercing chaos surrounding him now, there existed an ironic reflection. We often mistakenly believe that exhaustion is simply the biological bodus. Demand for deep sleep, but in truth, Elias' mind that this very moment was a perfect, miniature version of that great heat death. The root of that empty state did not stem from physical labor, but from the fact that his entire mental ecosystem had been siphoned of its last drop of orderly energy, leaving it flooded with stagnant chaos. The emptiness gnawing at him bore no resemblance to peaceful stillness. Rather, it was like a desolate region of space that had been drained of its vital essence, where all thoughts and emotions drifted aimlessly, too weary to connect into any fresh vibration. Much like a closed universe that has exhausted its fuel to light the stars, the delicate human mental system, when constantly forced to withstand the siege of modern noise, is also silently entering a phase of energetic decay, slowly sinking into the depths of inescapable disorder. The chaos gradually exhausting Elias' mind actually carries a cold, scientific name: entropy. In the realm of physics, the second law of thermodynamics states ruthlessly that in any closed system, the degree of disorder can only increase over time and never decrease on its own. Energy will constantly disperse, and all things will slowly slide from a brilliant state of order into a murky state of disorder until they reach the eternal equilibrium of death. The sorrowful part is that this silent and cruel law does not seem to rule only the distant, glittering galaxies above our heads, but is also silently taking root and dominating the narrow psychological space within each of us. Let us quietly observe how this young engineer, and perhaps a reflection of ourselves during those long, sleepless nights, struggles to face this depletion. When clearly sensing that the internal energy source has hit rock bottom, the natural reflex of a modern mind is to immediately issue an order to rest. But tragically, instead of truly letting go of all burdens to sink into pure relaxation, we inadvertently turn that rest into a new project, the next urgent mission that must be completed excellently. Sunk into a cushioned chair that had lost its form, Elias' mind did not shut down. Instead, it began a familiar and relentless cycle, frantically analyzing why it was this tired, scouring for solutions to handle the mountain of work waiting at tomorrow's dawn, calculating how to optimize the few remaining hours of sleep, or plotting a strategy to recover vitality as quickly as possible. We always nurture a naive belief that by thinking intensely about solutions, we are diligently tidying up the mess scattered in our heads. But alas, that is one of the most subtle and damaging illusions of the ego. Much like desperately trying to cool a sweltering, stifling room by flinging open the refrigerator door, the harsh truth is that the very motor growling at full capacity behind that fridge radiates a surplus of heat far greater than the thin sliver of cold air it breathes out the front. Similar to that paradoxical mechanism, every effort to apply logical thinking to force a panicked mind back into a state of peace requires an invisible price: the consumption of more energy. Ruminating on anxious thoughts, judging one's own fatigue, and wondering how to escape the weary emptiness does not clear away any of the dust of chaos. On the contrary, It lights the fire that burns the very last fragile remnants of order at the bottom of the soul. Once a human mind falls into the vortex of exhaustion, it is like a closed system frantically biting its own bleeding tail. The more we panic and struggle to escape the thick marsh of fatigue by using the very same mind that created that fatigue to think, the tighter we bind ourselves and the deeper we sink into the brutal pull of depletion. It is as nonsensical as a person trying to reach up and grab their own hair to lift themselves off the ground, and as hopeless as a psychological system already depleted to an alarming level deluding itself into thinking it can heal and restore its own vital essence if it persists in using the faint, flickering breath that remains to incinerate itself in futile efforts to resist the natural flow of decay. The extreme stalemate of that wounded, closed system forces one to reach out desperately to the outside world for an escape, a temporary numbing agent to soothe the pain of awareness, and for Elias, that tempting emergency exit lay right beneath his fingertips, sliding unconsciously across the smooth glass of a smartphone. Living in the heart of the magnificent, fog-shrouded city of San Francisco, which prides itself as the unceasingly beating heart of Silicon Valley, the young engineer was breathing the same air as the most brilliant technical minds on the planet, those who have been day and night designing a digital ecosystem so perfect it is terrifying. If we are brave enough to step back and observe deeply into the structure of that shimmering ecosystem, we will realize a bone-chilling truth: those vibrant applications, those crimson notification icons constantly beckoning, and those endless streams of news were not actually created to support the human soul. Instead, they were programmed with absolute precision to operate as gargantuan, tireless mining machines, hidden beneath the harmless veneer of global connectivity. The invisible ore that these sophisticated algorithms crave and continuously drain is not a natural resource, but rather the silent attention, the cognitive energy, and the priceless mental order of every individual. When Elias felt the weight of fatigue in his heart and decided to pick up his mobile device in the faint hope of finding a small joy to dispel the darkness of pressure, he had no idea that he had just voluntarily stepped into a psychological trap laid with incredible sophistication. The most cruel and common illusion of the civilized age is the confusion between entertaining oneself by scrolling through a phone and the true restoration of inner vitality. We often lull ourselves into believing that immersing ourselves in fleeting content is a way for the brain to relax after hours of stressful labor. However, every aimless swipe of the screen, every few-second video slipping past the retina, and every short status update crammed into the mind is silently forcing the nervous system to constantly analyze, compare, and produce chemical reactions. Even if they are the most subtle and weak reactions. The algorithm hidden beneath millions of lines of senseless code possesses a ruthless artificial intelligence. It knows exactly how to shatter a person's intact focus into countless tiny, sharp fragments, and then slowly strip away every last thin drop of orderly energy still gasping for life inside a weary mind. In this manner, within the silence of the dark room, Elias' vital essence and cognitive energy were drained bit by bit, leaking into a deep, invisible cyberspace, transformed into senseless data points to feed the endless expansion of giant technology empires. The tragic conclusion of this process of swapping the concept of self-amusement for self-healing is that after hours of being submerged in a virtual world, the young engineer felt no peace or freshness at all. Contrary to his initial desire, he was left abandoned with a desolate, hollow mind, possessing only fragmented, weak scraps of energy that were no longer enough to patch together a complete thought or emotion. His entire system of consciousness at this point had been completely subdued by maximum disorder, becoming a cluttered battlefield after those invisible thieves of order had nonchalantly swept through and taken the most precious gift of human existence, leaving behind a silence so empty it was haunting. Standing in the middle of the mind's desolate battlefield after the ruthless sweep of algorithms, the true solution does not lie in Elias forcing himself to stand up and pick up every piece of fragmented awareness or angrily throwing his phone into a dark corner. That act of violent resistance, the effort to try and re-establish order through rigid discipline or bitter declarations of digital detox, is actually just another form of sophisticated energy consumption, continuing to pour oil onto the fire of chaos that is unceasingly burning within. We always carry a belief that is full of pride but also incredibly blind that to solve a problem, we must rush into battle and use the power of will to crush temptation. But in this noisy and cruelly brilliant digital era, the the human mind is already too small and fragile before the giant machines designed for psychological manipulation, so every act of internal violence only leads to deeper exhaustion. At the darkest moment of this weariness, we need a philosophical first aid dose called wu wei. An ancient concept from Eastern philosophy meaning action in accordance with the natural flow without any coercion. Wu wei does not carry the negative meaning of gloomy resignation, cowardly giving up, or a lazy attitude of leaving things to fate. Rather, it is the profound meditative art of ceasing to provide core power to the things that are intentionally siphoning our attention. Instead of gritting his teeth and using an iron will to forbid himself from touching glowing technological device, an internal war where the ego often tastes humiliating defeat only to breed more toxic guilt and self-reproach. Art of Wu Wei advises the young engineer to simply loosen his tight grip and completely change the way he observes reality at this very moment. Imagine the flurry of notifications dancing on the screen, the piercing alarm sounds disrupting the silence, or even the rolling waves of urge from deep within the subconscious to swipe the screen aimlessly as just dark clouds hurrying across a vast sky of awareness. The great sky never reaches out its cloud fingers to try and hold on to a ray of sun or chase away a fierce storm. It only exists openly and silently, letting all things freely arise and pass away, and the storm can howl as it might but must eventually vanish into thin air. Similar to that great law of natural containment, when the mind stops judging the appearance of digital noise, stops labeling them as evil or dangerous, and ends all struggling in the desire to control or destroy them, the manipulative power of those invisible thieves of order is naturally stripped away. By relaxing his chest, taking a deep and gentle breath to let the urge of curiosity rise and then automatically settle like a wave hitting the shore without pouring any sharp attention or binding reactive energy into it, Elias is practicing a true miracle of inner healing, decisively cutting off all fuel for chaos. Liberation does not come from fleeing to desolate mountains without phone signals, but sprouts right in the middle of the noisy urban heart when we learn how not to cling to illusory stimuli. In the moment of courageously giving up the need to fight reality, a strange and deep relief will suddenly rush back like a cool stream, silently filling the hollow spaces that the senseless programming codes just ravaged. Absolute peace is never a bloody trophy we can proudly win through brutal struggles with our own ghosts. Rather, it is the original, pristine nature that will automatically manifest the very moment we decide to let our arms hang loose, smile and stop wrestling with the troublesome flows of the era, and gently allow ourselves to melt into the infinite silence of a pure existence without entanglement. As the wondrous silence of the art of Wu Wei begins to seep in and soothe the cracks in Elias' mind, let us slowly step out of the narrow cocoon of personal limitations with him to expand our perspective from the dark, quiet room in San Francisco to the entire vast surface of the blue planet named Earth. The depletion the young engineer just experienced was not an isolated phenomenon or a personal failure, but in fact reflected a great law governing this entire immense universe. Much like a tiny seedling yearning to pierce through dry, hard soil to reach for the sunlight, to be able to resiliently resist the ruthless pull of entropy, all living beings in this world need to be supplied with a great energy source from the outside, and the source nourishing that life is none other than the brilliant radiance of the sun that we often carry a latent pride when we imprison ourselves within the cramped shell of our skin, stubbornly painting an illusion that humans are completely independent, distinct entities, entirely separate from the operation of the world around us. The small self often deludes itself that the vitality flowing in the veins, the breath fluttering in the lungs, and even the sharp minds preoccupied with calculating glory are private property, something we created and own exclusively. However, if we quietly step back and remove the misty veil of that prideful ego, we will be overwhelmed to realize a humble and beautiful truth that brings one to tears. We are actually just transient flows temporarily borrowing energy from the vast universe to maintain this fragile form for a finite period. Every throb of the heart, every sparkling gaze reflecting curiosity, or even the block of energy Elias' mind just wasted wrestling with senseless lines of code, all originated from violent thermonuclear reactions taking place deep inside the core of a fiery star located millions upon millions of miles away. That glorious light travels through the dark and cold chasms of space, showering life upon lush green leaves, transforming into the nutrient source that grows all things, and finally converging in the form of a human, creating an exquisite dance of survival. When we understand this sacred and deep connection, we suddenly shed the 1,000-pound weight of loneliness. You are never a lonely oasis desperately resisting the pressure of decay. You are the glorious expression of the universe, the way the stars are admiring their own brilliant beauty. That temporarily borrowed energy does not require us to strain to prove our value of existence through dry work reports or virtual interactions on a phone screen. It just silently flows through, nourishing this biological body generously and unconditionally, reminding us that the greatest peace does not come from trying to snatch order for oneself, but from deep gratitude and the courage to let oneself lean into the great, protective embrace of heaven and earth. That awareness carries the power of a pure stream, washing away all desperate resistance of the ego, returning the human soul to its most complete and peaceful state, where we are both a tiny individual sighing and the entire void dancing with the bright stars. This awareness of borrowing silent energy seems entirely alien to the bustling world outside Elias' window, especially at the epicenter of human pride called Silicon Valley. This place does not nurture humble gratitude for the flow of nature, but instead is deeply obsessed with a desire for absolute control. That obsession does not stop at manipulating human minds through glowing screens, but reaches as far as the infinite reaches of space with megalomaniacal ideas like the Dyson sphere structure. This is a hypothetical megastructure drawn up by scientific minds, carrying the ambition to encase a giant star for the purpose of capturing and draining all the brilliant radiant energy it emits. The thinking behind this megaproject suggests that an intelligent species, given enough time to develop, will yearn to seize the entire energy source of the sun for itself to maintain civilization forever. Deep within that grand desire is actually a supreme fear of decay, a bottomless greed clinging to survival at any cost. Instead of accepting that all things have a natural cycle of birth and passing, humans want to build giant glass cages to imprison the very source of light that nourished them. And the bitter consequence of that predatory thinking does not wait until the distant future to manifest. It is ravaging our current home in every single breath. As we continuously extract and burn resources to maintain an illusion of order, thick greenhouse gases are accumulating in the atmosphere, absorbing light and causing atomic bonds to vibrate violently. The energy and heat that should have been released into vast space are now trapped, turning the world into a stifling furnace. As global temperatures unceasingly climb, this gentle planet is gradually becoming harsh and can no longer contain the diversity of all living things. Ultimately, the very desperate effort to maintain existence by manipulating all things is turning Earth into a place hostile to life, placing a giant question mark over the survival capability of all humanity. We yearn to reach out among the galaxies to cast nets to catch the stars, but blindly deny harmony with the ground supporting our footsteps. The collective ego of humanity is deluding itself that by consuming more and forcing nature to submit, we can defeat the eternal law of decline. However, the more we struggle to resist and exhaust the vitality of the surrounding environment to satisfy the craving for control, the more we only accelerate the speed of self-destruction. The macro-ego of humanity is exactly like the weary mind of the young engineer. The more it tries to use coercive power to seize order, the more it binds itself tighter to an inescapable crisis. The ego of humanity never submits to the idea of an inevitable end, and that stubbornness is most clearly revealed when we cast our eyes toward a very distant future, the time when the great fire of the sun must finally run out of thermonuclear fuel and expand into a ruthless red giant that swallows our beloved blue planet. Facing the unavoidable prospect of annihilation by the law of chaos, instead of calmly learning to accept the brilliant impermanence of the cosmic cycle of birth and death, the human mind once again panics and searches for a macro-scale emergency exit. From glamorous research centers, brilliant minds have conceived countless escape plans tinged with science fiction, such as the project to launch spacecraft with the ambition to break through to the stars. Scientists imagine a scenario where a fleet consisting of thousands of micro-spacecraft, barely larger than a postage stamp but carrying the entire heritage and genetic code of humanity, will be blown into deep space by giant laser beams fired from the ground. Those fragile sails of light will tear through the absolute silence of the night, racing away at a velocity of about 1/5 the speed of light, carrying the desperate yearning to cross vast chasms toward a new promised land at the nearest star system named Alpha Centauri. That grand migration desire, the callous desire to discard a dying home to blindly plunge into infinite darkness to maintain the order of existence, sounds like a proud epic about the rising power of the species. However, if we quietly step back a beat and calmly reflect, that desire to reach the stars reflects exactly and heartbreakingly the most familiar and weak defense mechanism of the human psyche. The act of launching ships to frantically flee a dying solar system is fundamentally the same as how a modern human stays frantically busy to flee internal wounds that have never been healed. When the soul becomes a ruin filled with fatigue and depletion, the first reflex of the ego is never to courageously sit amidst the ashes, quietly facing the pain to understand the root of that desolation. On the contrary, the ego always chooses to set sail and run. We cram our daily schedules with countless pointless appointments, frivolous promotion goals, extravagant trips, or constant changes in our work environment. We naively delude ourselves that in a new job position, in a new city, or grander still, in a new star system, all troubles will automatically evaporate and a peaceful life will naturally find us. But that noisy busyness, that hurried pace of life that modern society blindly worships, is actually just a desperate flight into uncertainty. Every individual is using the speed of outward busyness to escape their own dark shadow, terrified to the point of obsession that if their footsteps miss a beat, if the space around them falls silent for a few seconds, the dark shadow of meaningless questions, of emptiness, and of core pain will immediately catch up and swallow them. Refusing present stillness to plunge into uncertain projections of the future is the most expensive and hopeless effort to resist the law of chaos, because macrophysical flight or micropsychological escape share the same damaging illusion, believing that distance and space can dilute affliction, while the cruel truth is that even if you build machines that fly to the very edge of the universe, you still always have to carry that very same restless mind as eternal baggage. Let us go deeper into that macro escape scenario to see through to the very end of the darkness of efforts to cling to survival, where the final escape solution is realized in the form of generation ships. On a journey of unknown destination lasting hundreds or even thousands of light years through the coldest chasms of the universe, the generation of great pioneers who first stepped onto the ship will certainly never have the chance to see the new shore. Instead, they are forced to hand over the burden of survival to children born right in the heart of those giant machines floating in the void. In that dark region of space where sunlight is only a faint speck of light, the human mind is completely stripped from the protective embrace of Earth's biosphere, forced to face ultimate isolation. The inescapable imprisonment between cold metal walls and infinite space inadvertently breeds the most brutal space madness syndromes, where the human nervous system slowly gnaws on itself because there are no longer any natural stimuli to anchor it. More heart-wrenching than the erosion of psychology is a haunting moral paradox that few are brave enough to face. Creating new lives inside a mechanical box floating amidst the giant void is equivalent to imposing a life sentence on them without ever giving them the right to speak or choose. Those generations born among the stars will never know the feeling of walking barefoot on young grass or looking up to catch falling raindrops. They exist only as biological gears forced to operate to keep the giant machine continuing its hopeless journey, straining to shoulder a survival mission they never voluntarily craved. When quietly contemplating that distant space tragedy and returning to Elias' reality in the small room in the heart of the city, we will startle to realize a bitter similarity regarding the human condition. Do we truly need to build giant ships to plunge into the universe to taste the feeling of ultimate imprisonment, when the hurried cycle of modern money and bread has already been imprisoning billions of souls in a space no less stifling? How many of us are living lives programmed ruthlessly by the invisible expectations of society, by heavy financial pressure, and by illusory standards of success? We imprison ourselves in skyscrapers of concrete glowing with fluorescent lights, cutting off our silent connection with Mother Nature, whirling around to trade strength and inner peace just to pay for endless bills. We are just like the involuntary passengers on that generation ship, born and thrown into a closed social cycle, forced to unceasingly rush forward with a weary engine just to maintain the illusion of safety. The obsession with space or the psychological depletion of the young engineer actually shares the same sorrowful root. It is the tragedy of forgetting how to be a free human, turning oneself into a hostage of the giant systems created by oneself, struggling in a closed orbit where Every effort to exist only brings a sense of gradual suffocation instead of a truly complete and peaceful life. That the bitter realization of invisible imprisonment amidst hurried cycles leads us to touch one of the most core and silent philosophical truths of human life, a truth frequently buried under the constant human desire for movement, which is that no matter if you step to the very ends of the earth, you still always have to be present there with yourself. The grand and also tragic illusion of humanity does not lie in our arrogant belief that we can build giant machines to bend space, but in the incredibly naive belief that geographic movement can automatically bring purification to a soul that is in a state of turbulent mess. Try to quietly imagine the magnificent scenario when humanity actually survives through thousands of years drifting amidst the cold sea of stars, finally placing tired footsteps down on the surface of distant Proxima Centauri. If the passengers stepping out of that grand ship still carry in their chests a heart full of unrest, a mind flooded with the habit of comparison, judgment, and the desire to control all things, then what will that great migration ultimately bring? Surely they will again continue to ravage the new land, again diligently build stifling glass cages of competition, again weave together the circlets of survival pressure, and finally turn a pristine paradise into a perfect version of the hell they just fled. Returning to Elias' quiet apartment, the young engineer might also be nurturing a secret desire to submit his resignation. Tomorrow morning, discarding his entire career in Silicon Valley to find his way to a deserted tropical island or a secluded hut in the deep woods. But that physical flight is ultimately only a temporary anesthetic to deceive the senses. When the whirring sound of the cooling fan disappears, when the shrill notifications no longer ring out, the silence of the forest or the sound of ocean waves will quickly turn into a giant loudspeaker, echoing back into awareness and infinitely amplifying the screams of emptiness and anxiety that were always hiding deep beneath the veneer of daily busyness. When calmly reflecting on this, we will laugh bitterly at the most ridiculous game of hide and seek of the ego, where the self plays both the role of the panicked escapee and the ghost that is relentlessly chasing at its heels. How can a person escape exhaustion when they themselves are carrying the entire machinery for producing that exhaustion everywhere they go? The distorted lens of a soul straining under injury will always project its unrest onto any scenery, turning sparkling stars into threatening, flickering sparks and turning the pristine quietness of nature into overwhelming loneliness. Therefore, the truest and deepest liberation has never been at the finish line of a long physical journey. Complete peace is not a coordinate on a galactic map for people to part the waves of space to find. It is a state that blossoms brilliantly at the very moment we courageously stop all efforts to resist reality. When you realize that you do not need to move to any other shore to be settled, that right in the middle of this cluttered room filled with digital noise you can still take a very deep breath and choose not to identify yourself with that mess of panic thoughts, that is when you perform the greatest leap. The furthest distance in a universe is absolutely not a journey measured in tens of thousands of light years, but the distance of less than an inch from a mind frantically denying reality to a heart that knows how to humbly accept every moment present right now. As soon as that unconditional consent appears, the invisible prison doors of the stalemate immediately vanish, leaving an infinitely quiet space where the soul is free to take wing and fly among countless galaxies right in the present moment. To more fully understand the illusion of denying reality and the desire to flee from the inevitable laws of the universe, let us temporarily leave the stifling atmosphere in Elias' apartment in San Francisco to turn our gaze to another magnificent space sitting lonely amidst the foggy sky of the city of Seattle. There, behind the absolute soundproof smart glass walls of one of the most luxurious penthouses, we encounter the figure of Arthur, a legendary tech billionaire entering his 72nd year. Unlike the stalemate of a young engineer struggling to find his place in life, Arthur has climbed to the ultimate peak of fame, holding in his hands an invisible power that can manipulate markets and possessing a vast fortune enough to buy every most luxurious convenience in the world. But he is desperately kneeling before the only enemy that all financial powers are helpless against time. Elias is straining to resist the maximum level of chaos ravaging his mental ecosystem. Arthur is submerged in ultimate horror at the irreversible expansion of entropy right on his own biological shell. The fading of the physical body is actually the process of all things obediently following the second law of thermodynamics, where the order of cells gradually gives way to disorder, clearly expressed through the wrinkles etched deeper every day at the corners of the eyes, the liver spots spreading on the back of the hands that once powerfully typed the command lines that changed the world, and the weariness groaning inside every joint whenever the weather changes seasons. The ultimate fear of the billionaire is not just the primal survival instinct of avoiding death, but deeper down, it is the tragic consequence of a ruthless social prejudice that he and this industrial civilization have painstakingly built, that we are living in an era that blindly worships productivity, where the value of a person is shallowly measured by their ability to contribute labor and the speed of producing material wealth. In that distorted view of the system, aging is swapped for the concept of a shameful, terminal illness, a sign that this biological machine is gradually rusting, losing its sharpness, and about to enter the phase of being devoid of utility. When the signs of age begin to knock, instead of smiling to receive it like a proud medal of experience or a wonderful opportunity to let go of the burdens of competition and return to the silence of the soul, humans frantically pour money into technologies to hold on to youth, desperately covering up the truth that they are gradually dissolving. Arthur's mind, accustomed to controlling tens of thousands of employees and countless data streams, now beats incessantly in his chest with panic as he realizes he cannot order a wrinkle to stop appearing or tell a cell to stop aging. The desire to use the power of will and wealth to freeze the flow of timely effort to coerce nature to submit to a personal ambition for a fake immortality is the source of a lingering, tearing pain. Like reaching up to try and grasp and hold a cool breeze in a tightly clenched palm, the more he tries to protect and maintain this prideful, gradually decaying self, the more he pushes himself into a brutal internal war that certainly has no chance of victory, depriving himself of the right to live fully and peacefully in the rare, brilliant days remaining of a human life. To realize that desire to resist the laws of the universe and flee from inevitable fading, the billionaire Arthur decided to throw out massive sums of money to bet his soul on an unprecedented gamble called biological hibernation technology. The obsession with immortality led him to pioneering facilities, such as the startup project named Tomorrow.bio, which operates the first biological cryopreservation laboratory in Europe. At these state-of-the-art facilities, patients carrying an intense yearning for an extended life can pay a sum of approximately $200,000 to undergo the freezing process immediately after taking their last breath. However, to maintain the illusion of a perfect suspension of time, their physical bodies are not simply thrown into a freezing environment, because that brutal act would cause irreversible damage to the body tissues. Instead, technicians will meticulously drain and replace the entire amount of water inside the body with a special cryoprotectant substance. This chemical solution includes dimethyl sulfoxide and nepheline, acting as a suit of armor to protect the cells when the patient is flash-cooled to a temperature of -125 degrees Celsius, and then continues to be cooled slowly until reaching the threshold of -196 degrees Celsius. Once they have sunk deep into a state of absolute immobility at that extreme temperature, they will be placed for storage inside a specialized facility located in Switzerland, where they can lie waiting indefinitely as long as that temperature continues to be maintained steadily. This entire crazy and grand idea is built on a faint hope that the humanity of the future can revive these individuals sinking in hibernation as soon as medicine finds a cure for the diseases that took their lives, while simultaneously decoding how to wake a person from the cold realm of death. But the harsh reality is that until this very moment, not a single person has been successfully brought back to life, and scientists even fear that resurrecting these patients without causing serious brain damage might simply be impossible. Ignoring the dry technical barriers, let us quietly reflect on this act through the lens of philosophy of consciousness to realize the ultimate desperation of the human ego. Trying to inject streams of icy chemical solution into the veins just to keep a static self is actually the most painful denial of the impermanent dance of life. That we always carry a damaging dream that stillness equates to safety, that if we can freeze youth, preserve memories, and keep this form intact, we will win against the law of birth and death. But nature has never existed in the form of immobile statues. Nature is a great flow of unceasing transformation, where seasons take turns changing leaves and stars are continuously born and then extinguished. The suffering of human life does not stem from the fact that all things will fade, but it is born from our adamant refusal of that fading. When Arthur or any of us try to use artificial power to build a dam to stop the infinite flow of creation, the desire to prevent that change does not bring peace. On the contrary, it is the deepest source of all prolonged torment that the human body is essentially a waterfall of energy that is continuously renewed. Every cell is silently completing its life cycle to make room for birth. Clinging desperately to a past version of oneself, rejecting dissolution to pave the way for new orders to be born, only imprisons the soul in a cold glass cage of stalemate. The state of being neither alive nor dead inside those giant metal tanks is not glorious immortality, but absolute imprisonment, a prison made of ice designed by the ego's own fear. Instead of learning how to smile, relax, and appreciate the magnificent beauty of ephemerality, humans choose to turn themselves into high-tech mummies, forever stuck in the illusion of a future that has never existed, while simultaneously losing forever the right to fully harmonize with the vivid and brilliant rhythm of the tapestry of reality right in this moment. While the state-of-the-art cooling machines in Switzerland are still growling and consuming tens of thousands of kilowatts of electricity every day just to maintain a frozen illusion of immortality for billionaires like Arthur, at a dark and silent corner at the very bottom of the ocean, creation for millions of years has quietly displayed a biological miracle far beyond any most megalomaniacal imagination of humanity. The key to decoding the mystery of immortality does not lie in test tubes filled with toxic cryoprotectant chemicals, but is kept entirely inside the fragile, transparent form of a tiny creature scientifically named Turritopsis dohrnii, or known to the world with the awe-filled name of the immortal jellyfish. Completely different from the ultimate fear of humans before the expansion of chaos, this wondrous creature brings the most primitive and profound philosophical lesson about the art of letting go. When a mature jellyfish individual reaches the final stage of its life cycle in the Medusa form, extending proud tentacles to part the waves of the vast ocean, it does not struggle, it does not panic to find an elixir of life to hold on to a weary shell. Instead, it calmly lets itself sink gradually into the dark mud at the deep sea floor and absolutely follows nature, accepting for its body to begin the process of decomposition. But right at the moment when life seems to have been swallowed completely by the darkness of death, a miracle of biological reincarnation silently begins. All those cells in the process of fading suddenly reorganize their structure, but they absolutely do not force the reconstruction of the form of a proud mature jellyfish of old. They choose the great step back by reversing the biological time machine, reincarnating into the most primitive form of the life cycle, which is a polyp root system firmly attached to a cold rock surface, so that from that very humble root, new buds continue to bloom, turning into tiny, clear jellyfish entities, freely floating and writing the next part of the ocean's endless symphony. The whispered lesson from the deep ocean rings out like a clear meditation bell, shattering all the crazy illusions of the human ego. That jellyfish achieves the privilege of touching eternity not because it possesses an invincible preservation power to resist the flow of time, but paradoxically, exactly because it possesses an absolute surrender to impermanent change. It lives forever because it is ready to completely let go of the old form, courageously stripping away all the familiar biological structures of a self that has completed its life mission. In contrast to that beautiful and serene natural harmony, the lingering suffering of the human species, represented by the billionaire's desire to freeze time, stems from a blind persistence toward what is called the personal ego. We crave immortality, we also want to live forever, but we offer an irrational and arrogant bargain with heaven and earth that we only want to live forever if we can still keep this form intact, with all the fragmented memories, the rigid prejudices, the frivolous power titles, and even the scars of injury we have painstakingly collected throughout several decades of existence. The human ego always deludes itself in a pathetic way that if these narrow personal attributes are lost, if this familiar identity is stripped away, then existence will become completely empty and meaningless. It is exactly because of clinging desperately to an illusion of fixity in a universe where the only eternal law is unceasing change that we imprison ourselves in an invisible prison of anxious phobia. We tremble before every wrinkle, panic before every silver hair, because we identify our great life with the fragile shell that is being eroded every second by the law of chaos. If we are quiet enough to listen to the whisper of that tiny jellyfish, brave enough to realize that the death of an old form is not annihilation but simply a voluntary return of materials to the vast space to pave the way for fresher living orders to be born, then the ultimate obsession with fading will immediately vanish like a water bubble. True eternity has never been a reward for those who stubbornly use chemicals or machines to imprison the flow of time, but it is always a generous gift automatically awarded to free souls, those who know how to gently loosen the clenched hands, smile and melt into the endless dance of life and death, to allow themselves to be circulated, renewed, and brilliantly reborn in every miraculous moment of reality. Toc through the ultimate irrationality in the desire to freeze the body of billionaire Arthur, we need to boldly remove the common biological lens to step into one of the most classic and sharp philosophical paradoxes, named the ship of Theseus. Legend has it that the proud worship of the hero Theseus was carefully preserved by the people of Athens in the harbor year after year, but because wood always rots over time, each damaged plank was removed and replaced by a brand new plank, until one day not a single original piece of wood remained on the ship's hull. The difficult paradox posed is whether that wooden machine anchored there is still truly the Zeus ship, or if it has turned into a completely foreign copy. Now, let us gently place Arthur and the grand self he is desperately protecting into the very center of this difficult paradox. Modern biology has proven an obvious but often ignored truth: the human body is an unceasing reconstruction site where billions of old cells die every day to make room for new cells to be born, and after every cycle of about 7 years, almost all the matter making up our form has been completely renewed. The 7-to-2-year-old billionaire lying trembling, waiting for the cold chemical stream to be pumped into his veins, actually does not share a single atom or skin cell compared to the boy Arthur who once skipped and ran on sun-drenched lawns 6 decades ago. So the aching question raised is, when Arthur throws out millions of dollars to sign an eternal hibernation contract, which self is he actually trying to preserve: the innocent boy of yesterday, the proud businessman at the peak of his game 20 years ago, or an old man weary with age today? The harsh and also most liberating truth here is that the sense of a continuous ego, a unified and unchanging self existing throughout from birth until closing the eyes, is actually just a very sophisticated illusion, self-produced and self-performed by the mind. Our awareness is absolutely not a solid cast block or a seamless flow as we always assume. Rather, it is exactly like a reel of film put together from millions of discrete static photos. The human brain plays the role of an excellent movie projector, unceasingly patching together faint fragments of memory, repetitive habits, and familiar emotional reflexes to project onto a screen of awareness an illusion of the existence of a single main character named me. We cling to that identity woven by memory so desperately that we are ready to trade the brilliant present just to protect something that has no fixed entity. When realizing that the great self we have always cherished is not a static noun but only a verb that is unceasingly changing, the process of infinite circulation of energy flows and information, a narrow lens of fear immediately shatters. Trying to preserve that fragmented illusion with freezing technology is no different from using a fragile net to try and catch and keep the reflection of the moon shimmering on the lake surface. When understanding through the selfless void right inside this very entity that is breathing, we will no longer feel the need to strain against the laws of the universe, because simply there is no fixed self there to be lost or to fade, and that beautiful disillusionment will hand back to humans the supreme privilege of being free to be fully present in every short but extremely authentic moment of life. When the truth about the illusion of a fixed ego made of flesh and bone is exposed, the desperate human ego continues to extend its invisible tentacles to a new, more sophisticated, and more illusory destination. If the biological body is inherently too fragile before the erosion of chaos and freezing technology is only a delaying solution containing countless unforeseeable risks, then Arthur, with his vast wealth and desire for eternal immortality, has silently prepared for himself an ultimate backup plan named mind uploading. This dream of escaping into the source code is no longer limited to cold chemical tanks, but reaches for the desire to digitize the entire existence of a human. Imagine a science fiction scenario that is gradually becoming a serious research goal in Silicon Valley, where the entire complex neural network of the billionaire, the brilliant memories of youth, the sharp business experiences, and even the most subtle emotional vibrations are all meticulously translated into countless pure digital data strings. His entire consciousness will be completely detached from the weary biological shell to be transferred directly into a state-of-the-art supercomputer, turning him into a digital entity living forever with time. The ultimate temptation of this idea lies in the fact that it promises absolute liberation from all the most lowly earthly needs of the human condition. Under the form of shimmering code segments, Arthur will no longer have to worry about breathing oxygen, no longer have to fear sudden heart attacks or the devastation of illness, and better yet, he can easily copy himself and upload himself onto giant machines drifting aimlessly in the vast universe. We can see in this megalomaniacal desire a blind human pride in naively believing that the essence of life is simply a giant data file that can be peeled, extracted, and moved at will. The desire to completely cast off the burden of the body to live forever with machines is still just a more sophisticated variant of the ultimate fear of fading that we always avoid. Instead of learning to courageously let go of the narrow self, humans find every way to make that self indestructible by stripping away its most human part, which is biological impermanence. It is ironic when we recall the image of the young engineer Elias at the beginning of the story who was straining under the weight of extreme depletion because he was being drained of vital essence by the very digital ecosystem, and now, a billionaire yearns to voluntarily offer his entire banda to dissolve and become a permanent part of that invisible cyberspace. We lull ourselves with an illusory belief that the continuity of awareness can be preserved intact when transferring from a moist, warm biological environment to a dry, senseless circuit system. Turning oneself into a data stream floating among the stars seems to be the most perfect solution to avoid the permanent end of the universe, because a digital mind only requires an extremely small energy source to maintain an active state. However, as Arthur proudly dreams of waking up in a brilliant virtual space without the presence of a decaying physical shadow, he inadvertently walks to the edge of the darkest philosophical abyss that all state-of-the-art technologies are clumsily finding the answer to. The beautiful dream of immortality through mind uploading is actually hiding an achingly lingering question, an extremely thin boundary deciding whether mind uploading is a final glorious destination of life, or ultimately just a perfect illusion deceiving the ego. Before the eternal door of the void. To answer the aching question hanging on the boundary between life and the digital void, we must courageously face a towering philosophical wall that science often calls the hard problem of consciousness. The entire megalomaniacal ambition of billionaire Arthur and the brilliant minds in Silicon Valley are built on an extremely narrow assumption, which is the blind belief that human consciousness is simply a byproduct, a form of complex biochemical reaction arising from neural connections inside the brain. According to that ruthless mechanical lens, if you can scan and simulate exactly down to every electron the neural network of a person, then consciousness will automatically arise inside the machine like the way a light bulb automatically glows when there is an electric current. However, the pride of logical thinking has ignored the most sacred and mysterious truth of the human condition, which is the vivid experience from the first-person perspective. The physical lens can measure the electrical impulses dancing when Arthur sips a cup of hot tea. It can record exactly which area in the brain is glowing when he recalls his youth, but no mathematical equation or line of programming code can truly capture the quiet subjective feeling, the slightly tart taste lingering on the tongue, or the warmth seeping into the chest that only a conscious entity can experience for itself. If one day his entire mind data is successfully transferred onto a supercomputer, and that machine begins to communicate with his familiar deep voice, making sharp investment decisions exactly like him, and even complaining about the fear of death just like the way he used to, then will that machine truly be feeling existence? The philosophical wall warns us that it is very possible that the uploaded version is just a soulless shadow, a digital zombie programmed too perfectly to excellently imitate human reflexes, but inside it is entirely a murky darkness. It has no light of recognition, no self that is truly experiencing joy or gnawing on sadness. Confusing external behavioral expressions with the fire of consciousness burning inside is a fatal error of thought, because the map is never the actual territory and cold binary code strings can never contain the soul of all things. We exhaust energy to try and extract and preserve consciousness into senseless storage devices because we are too terrified of disappearance, but do not realize that the very desire to package life into data is stripping away the most sacred essence of existence. No one, including that machine itself, can verify whether the digital self carries the full vibrations of a soul. Even when that supercomputer continuously asserts it is the proud billionaire from Seattle, those declarations are only the result of an algorithm retrieving copied memory files, rather than originating from a natural continuation of authentic consciousness. Recognizing the ultimate helplessness of every technological platform in sensing subjective experience, we are pushed to the wall of illusion, forced to awaken from the delirium of an artificial immortality. The ambition to turn oneself into indestructible strings of command code is ultimately just one final desperate effort of the ego to resist the infinite flow of reincarnation, a tragic escape from the brilliant and fragile beauty of tangible life. Facing that unsolvable difficult truth, humans have no other path than to give up the wild desire to seize and freeze consciousness. This disillusionment is not a tragedy, but a loving invitation for us to slowly turn back to face the very self that is present right here, in a form made of flesh and bone that is unceasingly dissolving. Exactly the collapse of that digitization illusion will pave the way for us to step into a deeper self-inquiry, to ask if the ego that we are frantically finding ways to protect forever at all costs is truly an independent entity needing to be saved, or if it was always just a phantom cloud floating across the silent sky of true reality. That deep self-inquiry opens the door leading us into the most silent heart of the entire healing journey, where we receive the most profound and deep philosophical first-aid dose from the East named anatta, or no-self. In the panicked groans of a civilization always obsessed with defining and polishing personal identity, the concept of no-self is often misunderstood as a denial of existence, a cold void stripping away all joy of living. However, if we quietly reflect under the meditative lens of a wise guide, no-self is absolutely not a death sentence for the individual. On the contrary, it is the most brilliant and magnificent declaration of liberation. Let us look back at the root of all the suffering straining the shoulders of young engineer Elias or billionaire Arthur. It all stems from a very solid core illusion that each of us is a separate self, an isolated entity locked inside a shell of flesh and bone, always having to strain to defend against a strange world full of danger surrounding us. That we consume the entire vital energy of a human life just to build fortifications to protect that fragile self, from collecting material wealth and snatching frivolous titles to the megalomaniacal desire to freeze cells or copy consciousness data to flee from the scythe of time. But no self-wisdom gently peels back that veil of illusion, pointing out to us a clear truth that in fact there is no unchanging and independent core inside this form. Much like a brilliant whirlwind formed from the combination of countless wind currents, pressure, and temperature, but the whirlwind itself does not have a hard core for us to grasp and keep in a closed box. The self that we have always cherished and feared to lose is only a temporary intersection of countless causal conditions, a continuous flowing phenomenon of memory, feeling, awareness, and elements that are unceasingly being borrowed from the vast universe. That when the brilliant light of this understanding blossoms in the mind, a feeling of ultimate serenity will immediately rush back, soothing all the wounds bleeding because of depletion and fear. If there is in fact no fixed self to protect, then the entire need to strain against the second law of thermodynamics also automatically collapses. You do not need to panic when seeing chaos disturb your order, because that order was also always just a musical note ringing out and then fading in the great symphony of life. The fading of youth, the exhaustion of the mind, or even biological death are no longer ruthless enemies coming to steal your essence. They are simply the natural process when the universe is reclaiming the energy source it once favored you with alone to prepare for the next fresh reincarnations. That when shedding the 1,000-pound burden of having to be someone special and eternal, we achieve absolute freedom to simply exist. There is no longer a need to defend, no longer the tearing of desires to control all things. The human soul becomes light and clear. It expands to infinity, silently containing every rising and falling fluctuation of life with a gentle and deeply empathetic smile, realizing that right in the middle of everything unceasingly being born and dying, the truest peace always smiles and is present where hands know how to relax and where an intrepid heart courageously accepts its own wondrous emptiness. That when truly understanding the wondrous emptiness of the ego at the microdimension inside the soul, let us carry that serenity to cast our eyes back at the infinite macrodimension, returning to the dark prospect that once surrounded Elias in the apartment in the foggy city on that very first late night. The image of a faded, cold universe where all matter decomposes and all stars go out once appeared as a hopeless, inescapable curse of the law of chaos. We once closed our eyes and trembled, believing that heat death was an absolute endpoint, a cold and ruthless full stop for the entire epic of existence that no conscious creature could save. That state of maximum chaos was once seen as the final depletion of all things, when every energy flow was so flat that no ripple of change could occur. However, if no self-wisdom just shattered the illusion of a closed self needing protection, then modern observation science also brings a final dramatic point to break the illusion of a closed universe waiting for the day of annihilation. The grand secret turning over every prejudice and ultimate fear lies in a spectacular truth that this universe is not standing still, and it is also absolutely not locked inside any giant limiting box. Instead, it is unceasingly expanding in all directions with an unprecedented speed, reaching into the void with an unbelievable vitality. According to the theory of the infinitely expanding universe, space is not a stage with a fixed size where material actors gradually exhaust each other's strength and wait for the gray velvet curtain to fall. As space continuously expands, the universe itself is no longer a perfect closed system like the initial and rigid assumptions of classical thermodynamics. This foundational change carries an extremely shocking philosophical meaning, brightening even the darkest regions of space and human awareness. Because if the boundary of reality is always receding into infinity, if space is always unceasingly generating itself, then the potential for birth and the capability to create new orders are also absolutely without limit. The dark heat. Death we once terrifiedly imagined is no longer an eternal coffin lid slamming shut to imprison all things. Instead, the increase of chaos is exactly the necessary fertile soil to pave the way for more wondrous lives to continue to sprout. Life is inherently a grand and spectacular form of order. It possesses a wonderful power to take materials from chaos to weave complex structures full of art, from the spiral chains carrying the genetic code of cells to brilliant civilizations capable of looking up at the stars and contemplating their own sacred origin. In a universe always stretching and expanding without rest, the opportunity for life to continue to create diverse and richer forms of order is eternal. The deep darkness of space between galaxies is not a cold realm of death as the young engineer once desperately thought, but in fact it is a giant unpainted canvas, a necessary void being kindly stretched out by creation so that all things have enough space for the next passionate creative dances. When we realize that macro-existence itself also always carries an openness to infinity, the anxious phobia about an absolute fading will automatically evaporate and vanish into thin air like morning dew under the sun. Much like the mind of Elias or any of us, when falling into a stagnant state of depletion, it is because we turn ourselves into a closed system with circular thoughts, self-incinerating vitality, and the only solution is to bravely throw open the narrow doors of awareness to integrate ourselves into the grand expansion of heaven and earth. This vast universe is absolutely not a prison running out of energy waiting for the day of collapse, and your soul is also absolutely not a machine weary with age waiting for the day to be discarded into the past. Both those entities are infinite flows of countless possibilities, where the end of a brilliant star fading or the dissolution of an old form is simply a sigh of relief of transformation, so that from the very glowing ashes of chaos, a dawn of new orders continues to be radiant and proudly reach high. When the barriers of a closed system are removed and the prospect of an infinitely expanding universe begins to warm awareness, let us together perform the deepest philosophical synthesis about the nature of the void. Now, the absolute quiet space Elias once imagined or the darkness of fading Arthur always feared is no longer a cruel monster waiting to swallow all the achievements of humanity. We need to understand that the void is not a terrifying absence, not a black hole of meaninglessness. On the contrary, it is a pristine and infinite white paper, the necessary space so that music can find its voice and so that life can perform its brilliant dance. Try to imagine a world where everything is solid, where there is not even a millimeter of space between objects. Then how can there be movement or creativity? Exactly thanks to the empty space between musical notes, the melody can take form, and exactly thanks to the emptiness between molecules, the universe has room to expand and create new structures. From this wise perspective, entropy, or chaos, is absolutely not the archenemy silently destroying order. Rather, it is a rhythmic dancing partner of life. If order is stability and form, then chaos is freedom and the capability for unlimited transformation. Our life is in fact an exquisite and spectacular balance right on the boundary of those two forces. An overly rigid order will lead to freezing and death, while pure chaos will lead to aimless dissolution. But when order knows how to use the hand of chaos to renew itself, life will explode in a beauty never seen before. The great void we see at the end of time is in fact a state of pure potential, where all possibilities are silently germinating, waiting for a new creative impulse. We do not need to strain to prove our value against the void, because we ourselves are a part of it way the void self-reflects and self-senses itself through limited senses that when casting off the fear of emptiness, we realize that existence itself is a game of spontaneous cosmic inspiration, where each moment is a unique work of art painted on the fabric of the void. Fading and death are no longer tragic endings, but necessary silences in the music to prepare for a more heroic new chapter. The void is the great mother containing all, the final peaceful shore where all chaos is transformed and all order finds rest. The dance of life can only become complete and meaningful when it is performed with a deep understanding and appreciation for the space supporting it. Now, when looking at the empty space in the room or the empty space in the mind, we no longer see a threat, but see a loving invitation to begin to create, to begin to love, and to begin to exist in the most free way, because we know that we are always enveloped in the eternal embrace of a wondrous emptiness full of miraculous vital essence. From deep ruminations on the dance of the void and the infinite expansion of heaven and earth, let us together return to the foggy city of Seattle to witness the most silent revolution taking place inside the soul of billionaire Arthur. Standing in the center of the biological cryopreservation laboratory glowing with cold blue lead light, where giant metal tanks are silently imprisoning the hopes of immortality in absolute frost, Arthur suddenly feels an unprecedented sense of displacement. The steady growling sounds of the cooling system and the thick smell of disinfectant chemicals that used to be symbols for the power of conquering death now suddenly appear as the desperate efforts of an ego exhausted by fear. The whisper of the immortal jellyfish and the wisdom about the emptiness of no-self have begun to bear fruit in his awareness, illuminating a simple truth that trying to freeze existence is exactly the fastest way to strip away life itself. With a deep and slow breath, Arthur decided to perform an act that the world out there would perhaps consider crazy. He walked to the desk of the facility manager and requested the complete cancellation of his cryopreservation contract worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The moment of signing the name on that cancellation paper did not bring him a sense of loss or regret. On the contrary, it was like a passenger just deciding to step down from the stifling generation ship to breathe the free air of heaven and earth. Stepping out of the building of dry glass and steel, Arthur walked leisurely toward the coast, where the salty winds from Puget Sound were blowing through his silver hair and caressing his old face full of deep wrinkles. Instead of looking in the mirror and panicking to find traces of entropy fading, he closed his eyes and let that wind freely seep into every pore, sensing life vibrating intensely in every vein. Every wrinkle on the forehead, every liver spot on the hand was no longer a technical error of creation needing to be fixed or covered. They appeared as precious wood grains on the trunk of a great old tree, the mark of decades of experience, of smiles, of tears, and of both bitter lessons about letting go. We often mistakenly believe that life is a war to snatch order from the void, but Arthur now understood a simpler truth: life is the void itself dancing in a temporary form. He smiled, realizing that he was a part of the brilliant dance between order and chaos, a unique musical note ringing out proudly before melting into the silence of 1,000 autumns. Life is precious and sacred to this degree exactly because it carries within it a beautiful finitude. If a sunset lasted forever, it would lose its splendor. If a flower never withered, it would only be a senseless plastic object. That when Arthur looked down at his own hands, he no longer saw a decay that was coming, but saw a flow of energy borrowed from the stars joyfully performing its final mission to sense the most authentic reality. He no longer had a need to wait until a distant future to be revived by machines or upload his mind onto soulless machines, because right at this moment, when the warm feeling of the late afternoon sun warmed the skin and the sound of waves lapping harmonized with the throbbing heart, he was living more fully than all the glorious years full of control previously combined. The surrender of the ego before the law of impermanence is not a pathetic failure or a weak surrender. That is the greatest victory of a soul that has found the way back to original nature. The most powerful billionaire in Seattle is now simply an old man standing before the vast ocean, taking a breath that fills the chest and smiling with the void, because he has deeply understood that when we no longer cling to anything, when we courageously loosen the clenched hands, we will have the entire vast universe in our stillness. The moment Arthur turned his back on the cold laboratory to integrate into the stream of people on the street, He was no longer an individual gasping for life waiting for death, but a glorious presence enjoying every drop of the honey of the present time, turning every breath into a word of gratitude sent to the eternity of the void that our journey closes as the dawn of reality once again brightens the small apartment in San Francisco, where Elias opens his eyes for the second time in the long, quiet night. The room still has the mess of a busy life, the computer is still running with unfinished lines of code, but a silent and deep transformation has completely changed the surrounding atmosphere. Elias gently reaches out to fold the laptop screen, completely ending the labored whirring of the cooling fan that had drained his vital essence for so long. In the moment that sound went out, a miraculous silence rushed back to fill the space, but now it was no longer the deathly void or the terrifying nothingness that once made him panic in the first minutes of the journey. This silence now carries the breath of stillness, a wondrous emptiness containing every man's song waiting to bloom in an unceasingly expanding universe. The final message of the guide for Elias and also for you, those who are listening to this story, is to learn to exhale a very long breath and stop resisting all things around. We realize the most precious human lesson that peace is not something we have to frantically find in a distant star system or in expensive biological cryopreservation tanks, but is the natural reward for those who know how to loosen their hands and harmonize into the flow of the universe. The true value of a human life does not lie in how much order we try to seize or how long we maintain the ego, but lies in a capability to courageously accept the brilliant impermanence of reality right at this moment. The story of Elias and Arthur reminds us that every breath is an opportunity to start again, to love, and to exist without any coercion or anxiety. If you feel your soul has just been soothed and found a fresh perspective through this philosophical journey, do not hesitate to click subscribe to our channel, give the video a like and share it with the people you love, so that we can together spread and listen to more attractive videos every day. We really want to know how you feel about this story, whether the pressures of Elias or the fears of Arthur are reflecting your own anxieties in real life. Please take a little time to share sincere comments from deep in your heart, because each feeling from the audience is a priceless motivation helping us continue the journey of finding true liberation for the mind. Finally, allow us to send the best wishes for health to everyone and hope that every passing day your life is always filled with joy along with absolute peace. Thank you for accompanying psychological well-being throughout the journey of overcoming chaos to return to the wondrous void. Goodbye and see you in the next video.